With this lecture 9A, we're going to look at the Cycladic culture. Okay, so the Cycladics. Now, the word Cycladic actually is derived from the word kikros, which means circle in Greek. And if you look at the currents, remember last time I was talking about the currents here in the sea, they go in a circular fashion. So it has some reference to do with the currents, the circular currents that you have throughout this area. And so we named the culture that thrives in this area around here, the Cycladic culture. What we see is it's a culture that thrives just a little bit before the Middle Bronze Age period. We're looking at about 3000 to 2000 BC. And what we have in evidence are statues, nude statues. This is female statues, but there's some male statues as well. They have these characteristics. They're slender, they're angular, they have the sharply defined nose, very abstract appearance. Some folks might think of it like even maybe more primitivism of the 20th century look. Arms folded across the midriff, and paint pigment suggesting that it was painted, not just a white statue. And they're made out of marble. If you remember last time, I mentioned with all that seismic activity, you have limestone being metamorphized into marble, which is a very strong rock, but you can carve it easily. Okay. One thing I should mention before I go any further is we're looking at textbook. If you're in the first edition of the textbook, it's pages 35 to 37, roughly the first 3 pages. And if you're in the second or third edition, 39 to 41. And you'll find a couple questions about this culture in the course pack, something on page 42 and something else on page 47. Okay, so we got this white marble, which is abundant, and arms folded across the midriff. They always depicted this, right? They're very slim characters, unlike your Willendorf Venus figures. Angular, a lot of angularity, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Very abstract. And the nose. The nose is always carved out, okay? So think about this. If we were to, say, draw a face, and there's a circle. Okay, what do I need? I need eyes and a mouth. There you go. And you recognize that that's a face. But probably my guess is the Cycladic folks would look at this and think it's not a face. There you go. Now it's a face. Guess you got to have a nose. All right. So to look at some of the examples we see here, what do we got? Notice the nose is carved out, very angular. See that triangular shaped head. And long neck is another feature that we see sometimes, not always, but it's very common. Slender figure, angular arms folded across the midriff. Okay, that's a very curious thing. We see that more often than not. Okay, now this leads to another thing I have to bring up about the Greek culture in general. And that is some obsessions that they have, okay? And this particular obsession, this first one, I'll mention another one in a later video, has to do with math. Okay, so did the Greeks invent math? No. Do they engage in it at this time in a high level? Not particularly. But what we find is that from the very beginning of the Greek culture, there is always this interest in the nature of math, which in our real world is often expressed in terms of geometry, right? The relationship of different locations, 2-dimensionally or 3-dimensionally, to each other. Okay, the Greeks are really, really into this. Now, are there other cultures that are into math? Yes, of course. In fact, all world cultures engage in math on some level. But there's something that underlies the Greek culture about math, an obsession about it, that seems to be one of a few things that separates Greeks from anyone else, okay, the ancient Greek culture from other ancient cultures, and maybe even going into more modern times. So they haven't even developed a mathematical language. So how do we know they're obsessed with math? Well, remember the figurine I was looking at there, slide or two back. You look at it and you realize that the human form that is shown is really a geometric form. This suggests that the way they see it is everything in nature can be understood in terms of geometry or math. Okay, so if you want to understand the universe, learn math, and that will be like a key entry into grasping what's going on in our world. Okay, um, here we see more of those figures, folded arms folded across the midriff, slender, angular, the nose carved out. And all these seem to have long necks. These also have long necks, but not as much. Notice these figures are holding the center figure, and not always female figures. Sometimes we see male figures, but notice the arms folded across the midriff. Here we see somebody playing a harp, but we still see that abstract angularity, okay? This one's a little more organic. We see details of an ear and the face, more so than usual. I suspect, I don't know that this is a later one. A lot of the Cycladic artifacts were looted heavily in the 1800s and early 20th century. And so they don't have what's called provenance, okay? Provenance is we have an artifact and we know where it was found, what level of dirt. It was documented by an archaeologist. Instead, you got this ancient roll of duct tape was unearthed by some archaeologist. He doesn't remember where or care. He just wants $20 for it. Okay, and he's not really an archaeologist. He's a looter. Okay, so so many questions. What level of dirt was it? Because we want to know what age it is, what was found with it, what was found around it. We don't know. So these pillaging type of archaeologists that create stuff for the market, and I hesitate to call them archaeologists, although they do have to have some knowledge of that. They flood the market with these artifacts, and they're interesting. You could say they're old, but they could be fake. And how do you know the difference? Provenance, in other words, documentation is very critical. So a lot of that is missing in many of the Cycladic artworks. And you see that in other areas as well. Notice the head here. There would be paint pigments, very microscopically evident, suggesting that this was painted. So it could have been very garish, in fact, the brightest colors they would have used. We have this idea, this notion that everything that is ancient Greek is these white columns, white pillars, white marble, because marble is really pretty, right? But they would have thought how cool it is to paint things. And they would have made their buildings and other structures more colorful than a Mexican piñata. It was just, hey, they're making art here. Okay, so we see this one's very angular. Notice how angular, but the nose always carved out, long neck there. Here we have a drinking vessel. And it looks like a type of a badger here holding it. And if you fill up the cup, you actually get more wine than just a cup's worth, because you see that hole here. To fill that cup, you have to empty a whole bottle of wine into this little badger belly here. And that'll keep you going for a while. All right, this is an organic shape, an animal. But look carefully. What do you see? You see squares, you see rectangles, you see lines, circles, you see geometry, okay? So notice that although, to the best of our knowledge, they did not have a mathematical language, in other words, numbers to write down and figure out things that way, they intuitively grasped mathematics. Okay, here's a nice, elegant, probably a serving, a gravy bowl of some sort, possibly a pitcher for some sort of liquid. I'm not sure. I don't know the archaeological period so well, this particular one, what this would serve. But they've made vessels different shapes, so that you would know this one's water, this one's gravy. You don't want to get the two mixed up. This one's wine, this one's vinegar, because you can't see through them. And so they're developed different shapes. Oh, and then this. Now, what you're looking at right here is basically scrap paper. Okay, you could think of it as that, right? Somebody writes a message and then throws it away. But in this case, this little scrap paper happened to get thrown away somewhere, and then later on, that location caught on fire. And remember what I mentioned about these single media artifacts? They're made out of one thing, in this case, clay. So they don't have other materials that either chemically change them or mechanically prime apart. So they preserve well. And in the case of these clay tablets, they bake in the heat of a burning building and become harder and last longer. Okay, so I mentioned that the Cycladics did not have a writing system for math or language from what we can tell, but they had symbols. And what we see here is, like I said, scrap paper. It's a lump of clay. Somebody's testing out his seal. It's like a stamp. It's like, how much pressure do I need to use on this? Okay, good. And then put his seal on something, either that he made or that he sent for delivery or what have you. Okay, and remember, just like in Mesopotamia, the study of these seals, these stamped images, is called sphagistics. That silly word there. We see they're very geometric. Even the spider here, I think that is 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, he's got the correct number of legs, so it's a spider. Here we see, I believe those to be water pitchers here in these symmetry, the symmetry that's going on here. Geometry rules in this culture. We do see these swirl patterns, very interesting. This is, I think, a little later in the Cycladic period. Where they lived, well, their economy was fishing based. So it's not a surprise that we find the ruins of these Cycladic cultures near the modern day sea, not too far. Of course, sea levels kind of come up and down. There's deposition, there's erosion, but we do find these Cycladic culture folks living near the sea where they would go fishing. Okay, so we see Cycladic circular from the Greek word kyklos, a reference to the currents. We see that they engaged with what we call the study of those stamped images phlogistics. So they've left a few of those things, but no written language that we can tell so far. And their culture can be identified by these white marble statues, the arms folded across the midriff, slender, angular, abstract-looking nose, always prominently carved out, very much so, and evidence that they would have been painted various colors. And from this beginning, we see the Greek culture will further demonstrate their interest in mathematics, obsession with mathematics. And that is all for 9A. We will look at a culture that they sort of morphed into or were absorbed into or fused with. That comes a little bit later, and that is the Minoan culture. That'll be it for 9A.